Welcome to the show, Getting High on Anthropology. Today we have a very special guest. I'm going to have you introduce yourself.
My name is Bradley Jahan Borougerdi. I'm assistant professor of history at Tarrant County College. My manuscript, the title of my manuscript is From Court of Empire to Banned Intoxicant, A Cultural History of Hemp in an Atlantic World from 1600 to 1900. I'm working with Oxford University Press at the moment. The manuscript is with them. And in terms of courses that I teach in the history department or the global studies department technically, but I am a cultural historian, I teach world history courses from a commodities perspective. I teach African American history, and I teach the U.S. history survey courses. And occasionally I will teach a course, an upper level course at the University of Texas at Arlington as an adjunct on the hemp plant and hemp and culture.
Excellent. And I came across your work as I was preparing for my course at CU Denver called Cannabis Cultures. So you have been studying hemp for quite a bit, and you did a dissertation on it. So tell us about the study that you did and one or two of the most compelling findings in your work.
Yeah, so one of the things about this dissertation, which is now a book manuscript, is that it's a little bit controversial because people ask me, well, what is hemp? And they assume hemp is always associated with fiber. And one of the things I found, the most, I think, important thing of this book is that there is this sort of intertwined history between the three main uses of the hemp plant, right? And I think that when you begin to do research and look into the sources, you find that the phrase hemp has been qualified and used to describe the medicinal uses, the intoxicating uses, as well as the industrial uses. And although even today the industrial uses are the main associations with the word hemp, we still see these lingering kind of historical realities that still associate the word hemp with various other uses. And so one of the things that my work does is try to kind of look at the plant holistically, look at it and look at how these different meanings of this word have helped Anglo Americans as well as Anglos in the UK to fashion a meaning for the plant that dramatically transformed then from what they used to see this plant as, right? In the Anglo-Atlantic culture is what I call it, this kind of transatlantic dialogue between the British subjects of the colonial British Empire and as well after the American Revolution, this kind of dialogue between what is this plant? Is it valuable? Is it not? And it kind of was perceived to be an extremely valuable plant and then dramatically transformed, as you know, to this banned intoxicant that we're still dealing with. And so my book tries to trace that cultural transformation that this plant endured.
In the publication that you have, it's filled with some images. So do you want to tell us about one or more of those images and what they mean to you?
Sure, yeah. So there were a number of different images from a vast array of different sources that were really perfect for this topic because they all bind the meaning of hemp together in different ways, right? And so I have some of them, say, for example, William Bailey. He has multiple of different sources from the 18th century, the mid-18th century. And this guy was simply just a member of the Royal Society promoting the arts of manufacturing. He was writing treatises that were designed to try to influence people in the British Empire to try to grow hemp. Because despite what many people think today, particularly hemp activists, hemp was a very difficult plant to grow and to produce and to ensure that it was high enough quality to be successful. This is why they had to rely so heavily on Russia for most of their hemp production. And so there were a number of these different treatises that had very specific details about how to grow the plant, the best way to do it, tried to promote a lot of people to do so. And if you look at William Bailey's sources, you see these very kind of Enlightenment images that are trying to describe how, the best ways to grow it and manufacture it, right? And so you see these very elaborate, intricate details of these lithographs that were published, which were rather expensive at the time to get published and put in these books, that are trying to kind of show people how to do this. And if you look at these images, they hold this kind of connotation of enlightenment the Europeans are sort of on the march. They're trying to figure out the world. They're trying to understand the world. And these images in his treatise really kind of indicate that hemp was a part of this new modernizing world, this attempt to kind of take commodities, manipulate them into the way we need them used. And these images, I think, really kind of capture this industrial nature of hemp's production. And you still kind of see that today. For example, many people use this Popular Mechanics article, 1938 article that says, hemp was destined to be the next billion-dollar crop before the conspiracy theories destroyed it. And I think looking at William Bailey's images, along with a number of others that continued throughout the 18th and 19th century, looking at those help us understand that this Popular Mechanics article was just one in a series of articles that came out regularly where people were really trying to promote this idea that hemp needs to be used a little bit differently, needs to be manipulated differently, and we got to really promote this idea if we're going to be successful in trying to get people to produce it.
Is there one or two images that are more contemporary that you just want to share with us from your manuscript?
Sure. Yeah, there's an image there that I found at the Houghton Library at Harvard University. There's this collection there that was given. It's called the Santo Domingo Fitzhugh Ludlow Santo Domingo Library kind of collection that has all kinds of stuff connected to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And one of the images that I found there that doesn't have an author listed. It's called "Free the Weed," and it has this cannabis leaf with glass on it that's being chained up. And I just love that image because, number one, it's the very kind of iconic cannabis leaf, which many people call the marijuana leaf. Again, erroneously, but the cannabis leaf, which evokes so much meaning for so many people. This is the leaf that, as you saw in one of my other images, shows a boy, Joe's story, looking at it in a very kind of menacing way. And that image shows this kind of negativity. Contrast that with this new image here, which is a more contemporary image, a modern image, and you see a much different meaning, a meaning to sort of rally up, to try to demonstrate this oppression that is connected to sabotaging people's lives because of this plant. And another image there that I found off a blog is a fascinating image as well of Thomas Jefferson with somebody kind of putting a little joint in his mouth like he's smoking it, which kind of obviously plays on these ideas that have been around for a while that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson smoked marijuana, which of course we have no evidence to suggest that was the case. And in fact, when they write in their, or it's particularly George Washington, when he writes about separating the female and the male plants, many people said that's code. He was growing sinsemilla. No, you had to separate that as well if you were growing hemp industrially for seeds versus growing hemp industrially for fiber. But I love these images because they just show how far the transformations in perspective has come, and the same plant, dramatically different interpretations of it depending on who's interpreting it.
So circling back a bit, you talked about the different words, cannabis, hemp, marijuana. So for clarity, what do they refer to and what misuses of these terms have you seen throughout the years?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And the misuses are just so pervasive. Many people oftentimes say that marijuana is the cousin of hemp, for example, right? Or hemp is a type of marijuana that doesn't get you high. And it's rather surprising just how, misused the word marijuana is, even in books that I love tremendously, like, this new recent one that came out by Chris Duvall called Cannabis. In certain areas, he refers to the term synonymously as well, and multiple sources do this. But I think, since words are so important to my analysis, it's important for us to understand that we need to be able to separate these words because words mean something. Words carry very significant meaning. And if we're not using them precise, then we can evoke meaning at times that we're not trying to evoke certain meanings, right? And so to be clear, marijuana is a flower that grows on a specific genetic variety of the hemp plant. The hemp plant, the word hemp can and should be used synonymously with cannabis. Those two are the same and mean the same. They hold different connotations, though, right? I mean, when you think of cannabis, oftentimes when people are writing about it, they're writing about medicine, or they might think of, I mean, we have had this word medical marijuana come more frequently as of late, but still, cannabis tends to hold a medical marijuana connotation more. Marijuana itself tends to hold a little bit more of a recreational connotation, and hemp tends to hold a little more industrial connotation. But it's important, I think, for my study and for people to understand who are interested in my study, is that in terms of for history, for historical purposes, the term hemp and the term cannabis are in fact synonymous. And the word hemp has been used and manipulated so many times throughout history. If it's oftentimes when Anglos would be referring to the intoxicating version, they would call it Indian hemp because they associated Asia with this kind of Orientalist perception of these lazy kind of degenerates who take good, productive commodities from the West and contaminate them by turning them into drugs. And many people thought that the intoxication of hemp was something that the environment in the East did to this plant. Of course, they didn't really have much understanding of THC or the chemical properties of the plant while they were making these assumptions. But I think that's important to understand. But also, and we see this quite significantly in the Americas as well, people started to use the word hemp also to simply identify any plant that was used for fiber, plants that had no botanical relationship to hemp at all. If Americans saw that plant used as a fiber, then they would refer to it as hemp. And this kind of creates some deep confusion in the sources, because when Americans say Indian hemp, oftentimes they're referring to Native Americans using various different plants for fiber that have no relationship with hemp at all. But when the British use the word Indian hemp, they're referring to Indians in the subcontinent using the cannabis plant that they associated so much with fiber for improper uses. And so all of this stuff, I think, demonstrates that there is this whole topic is rife with confusion and misinformation and carries so much baggage with it that needs to be broken down before we can actually have a conversation, if we really want to understand why this plant transformed the way it did.
So to summarize, what's the terms that you think are useful and why? So like in one or two sentences, just to pull together that great response you just shared with us.
Sure. So I would say that hemp is the best word. Hemp is the word I use. Hemp is the word that I use in the title. And the reason I do that is because hemp is the only one out of all of these words that we know today to describe this plant. Hemp is the only one that has historically been used by different people in different Anglo societies to refer to all three of the main uses of the plant. And I think that is the most important point, because if we want to understand why this plant transformed the way it did, then we need to understand this very important fact, because people were confused about hemp. They were deeply confused about hemp, still are, but they were deeply confused about hemp, and that confusion and their use of that word is what I think contributed significantly to this transformation to an intoxicant that we have today.
Because of my interest in and background in the sustainability world, I find industrial hemp to be one of the most amazing topics that I could ever get involved with. The fact that it uses less water, it can help improve the soil, it can be anything you can make out of plastic, you can make out of industrial hemp. It's a very nutritious food. There's so many industries that it has positive effects on that I just see the industry growing tremendously over the next decade. I believe it's definitely time for hemp to become legal at the federal level, because up until the early 1900s, it was one of the largest cash crops in the United States. A tax was put on at that point that really eliminated the ability for farmers to make any money, but that was removed for 2 years during World War II, when we grew as much as 40,000 acres of industrial hemp to help in the war effort for rope and sails and lots of different products like that. So we know we can do it, and we have farmers who are ready to grow. Approximately 29 states have passed legislation that allows farmers to grow hemp in their state. However, industrial hemp is not legal at the federal level. So as an association, we decided that one of the main priorities this year is to help pass the Industrial Hemp Farming Act, which will deschedule industrial hemp, remove it from the Controlled Substances Act, and allow farmers to grow it in any state in the U.S. The largest obstacle right now is the lack of education. Most legislators still don't understand that industrial hemp is a crop and it's not marijuana. So we're having to spend a lot of time educating them as to the difference between the different crops. I'm standing at the Capitol here in downtown Denver, and this year there's going to be some additional legislation proposed. One of the biggest changes that we're going to see is in allowing for the recycling and reuse of hemp and marijuana stalks and stems. Right now it has to be destroyed and thrown away into a landfill, when the reality is there's a lot of components of that are very, very beneficial and valuable if allowed to be reused. Part of the confusion right now is that marijuana is a drug because of the THC. Hemp is not a drug. It's a crop, but it has a lot of other products in it that are really useful in a lot of different ways. So there is some dynamics right now where some of the extracts from hemp are being challenged by the marijuana community that it should be under the control of the Marijuana Enforcement Division. And that's something that the hemp industry doesn't feel is appropriate. I think what I'm most optimistic about here in Colorado is in 2014 we grew approximately 250 acres of industrial hemp. Last year we grew over 2,000 acres, and this year we're on schedule to grow as much as 20,000 acres. So just seeing the amount of activity going on, the number of jobs being created, the income that is being generated, and just seeing how excited all the people are that are involved in this really gives me hope for the future.
So you maintain this idea of no value claims. So why is it important for you to remain neutral or to avoid bias in your hemp studies?
Well, that's another great question. Well, first off, as a historian, you should always try this, no matter what your topic is. Of course, as a cultural historian, I admit that it's impossible to mitigate your biases, right? We all have biases. You cannot escape them. All you can do is try to minimize the influence of your bias as much as possible in order to demonstrate more objective value of your work. But I felt compelled to say that at the beginning of my manuscript because, particularly with this topic, hemp has so much baggage on both sides. People who write about this plant either hate it so badly and want everyone to see how horrible it is, or they love it so much and they think it's the greatest thing on the planet and they want everybody to see how wonderful they are. And both sides tend to make sweeping generalizations that do not reflect reality. And obviously, if you're a hemp activist, it has almost become kind of like a rite of passage to describe the ridiculous nature of reefer madness and the notion that you go murder people when you get high on marijuana and things like this. And everybody sort of comically looked at these things and talked about how ridiculous all of this stuff is. And then, therefore, has led them to believe that everything that comes from that period is worthless and it's all wrong. And then they start kind of propping up all of these other myths. Like one of the things you hear people say, which I was at a cannabis conference a couple of weeks ago here in Fort Worth, and one of the speakers got up and said, "You all need to read Jack Herer. He's a god. His book, Emperor Wears No Clothes, it's full of truth. It's the greatest thing." And it debunks all these conspiracies. But, that's not a very good scholarly book. I love Jack Herer's activism, and I love what he stands for. But there are so many sweeping generalizations in that book that really do not reflect reality. And that's not the only one. I don't want to pick on Jack Herer. Almost every book that I have read is full of either some sort of misinformation or exaggeration in order to get somebody's agenda done. And as a cultural historian, as I said, you can't end your biases, but as a historian in general, you want to kind of step back from that stuff and provide as much sources to the historical community to demonstrate to them that, look, I'm not taking sides here to try to pick something and promote an agenda at the expense of scholarly research. Scholarly research is important. And I make the argument throughout my book that I don't need to have an agenda because I think the sources speak for themselves. It's quite clear that if you don't manipulate sources, you don't try to pontificate on whether or not George Washington smoked marijuana or Jefferson smoked marijuana, which there's no evidence for, and you actually just stick to the sources, you can still accurately determine the activist conclusion, I believe, which is that it is rather nonsensical that this plant is illegal today.
One concern that researchers have as they go into this topic is the issue of being stigmatized. So as you did this work and in your current work in hemp studies, have you been stigmatized, or what suggestions would you have for young scholars who are considering but maybe waffling because they don't want to be associated with this toxic topic?
My first response would be yes, it is there, it is going to be there, and you're just going to have to deal with it. You have to love your topic more than you fear stigmatization, I think, because it's going to be there. Every single time I have presented on this topic, every time I have introduced myself almost to some people, whether or not they're academics or in the private sector or what, it doesn't matter. They cannot go 5 minutes without cracking a joke the first time, or you got great research opportunities, or they'll say some kind of thing that hints at the intoxicating nature of it, right? And this is something you're going to have to deal with. People snickering because there's just so much misunderstanding and so much cultural meaning, thick description, or I should say really thick meaning invested in this plant that evokes so much meaning in people's mind. And so I've dealt with it forever. And in a way, in terms of my personality, I just sort of embrace it and then just like, fine, whatever. I don't have an issue with it. But I can see how serious and problematic it can be, particularly for people who have an image that they want to portray to society. I can tell you'll have to deal with that, and it's there. It's very real. All I can say is that I hope it starts to go away. The more people become desensitized, I should say, maybe towards hemp and marijuana and all of its uses. So it's there.
Any last closing remarks, something we didn't cover, or anything you just want to provide as we wind up the interview?
And one of the images that I have by William Hogarth that shows the harlot beating hemp, this is something I really would like to point out, because there are so many different, back to these misperceptions and things like that, there are so many different reasons why hemp becomes so demonized. And one of the reasons that we don't tend to see oftentimes in the sources is the labor realities of hemp and the individuals who were involved in producing this hemp. In that image, you see these harlots women who've been arrested, who are in trouble, and they are being forced to beat hemp as a way to kind of, mete out their punishment. And in the United States, we oftentimes forget that slave labor was the primary engine behind hemp labor as well. And both of these forms of labor, slave labor, convict labor, these aren't people who have very much motivation to be very well. They're not being compensated for their labor, obviously. And it was very difficult to get people who weren't forced to actually use their labor on this plant, because it is a very labor-intensive plant. And this labor reality of this plant is one of the main reasons why it never succeeded. One of the things I would really like for people to understand is that if you look at the resource, you don't need to conform to or endorse these sort of conspiracy theories, to use a lack of better words, I guess, or a better phrase, to come up with why it is that hemp did not succeed. It's very simple. The plant was very difficult to produce. It was hard. They didn't have the machinery, despite trying on multiple occasions to create new technology to help it. It didn't work. And they weren't processing it properly. They were using something that they called dew rotting as opposed to water retting, which is what the Russians used. And all of these things here are very important to understanding the story for why hemp became a problem. And rather than try to say it was the greatest plant on earth and this huge wave of people came in to try to demonize it, to William Randolph Hearst and all these things. If you look at the actual sources, these people actually thought that this plant was bad because the history around it suggested so. People who were perceived as criminal, people who were perceived in negative ways, were the ones who were associated with this plant from a very long time. And those who tried to use it for productive purposes oftentimes were unable to do so. The tinctures that people started to make, once the Americans started to realize that this could be something that's used for medicine, the way they were making the tinctures did not work. The type of things that they were using did not work. So all of these things kind of combined to say, well, look, there's all of these things that we have that we're trying with this hemp plant. It's not working. And we hear all these strange stories about these people from the Orient who are using it and doing strange things and going crazy. And all of this stuff kind of led to the knowledge culture that was created that helped people jump to the conclusion that hemp is bad, that we don't need it. And now that we have more research to know that most of all of those perceptions about the plant were culturally constructed, then we can now start using what we know to back off if we can mitigate our biases and our perspective, which obviously is being a really difficult thing to get people to realize in many areas of the United States.
So Bradley, thank you again, and I really appreciate talking to you. And I know my viewers are going to really enjoy hearing a lot of your responses. So you have a great day.
You too. Thank you, Marty. Take care.